It didn't start with quiet negotiations or polite diplomacy, it began with desperation. In late 2024, Ghana, once hailed as one of Africa's most promising economies, stood on the edge of collapse. Debt had ballooned past 85% of GDP, the cedi tumbled to record lows, and the country's reserves could barely cover 6 weeks of imports. Markets panicked. Banks prepared for a liquidity crisis. Families queued in the streets waiting hours for fuel and food that only yesterday felt within reach. What looked like prosperity during election season had transformed into a brutal free fall. And then, almost like a lifeline tossed to a drowning swimmer, came $367 million from the International Monetary Fund. A bailout that promised stability, but carried conditions as sharp as chains, higher taxes, tighter spending, and outside auditors watching every move. On paper, it was rescue. In reality, it raised a haunting question: had Ghana reclaimed stability, or simply traded one form of crisis for another, sovereignty exchanged for survival? This is not just an economic story. It's a human story of teachers waiting months for salaries, of small business owners on the edge of bankruptcy, of parents struggling to stretch one more meal from an already thin wallet. It is also a continental warning. Africa's most celebrated democracies remain dangerously vulnerable to the cycles of debt and dependency. So I ask you, is Ghana's deal with the IMF a turning point toward responsibility and independence? Or is it the familiar trap that keeps Africa in economic chains, no matter how much progress is promised? And more importantly, can another path, the path of true sovereignty that leaders like Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré champion, still be taken before it's too late? Please share if you feel Africa deserves to choose its own destiny. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. By the end of 2024, Ghana's economy was no longer just wobbling, it was bleeding from every vein. What began as a wave of pre-election spending subsidies, expanded public wages, hiked flashy projects rolled out to win hearts quickly turned into an uncontrollable flood. Fiscal discipline, once celebrated in international reports, was shattered overnight. The numbers told a story more brutal than any politician's speech. Debt climbed above 85% of GDP, and interest payments alone consumed nearly half of government revenues. Ghana was no longer borrowing to build, it was borrowing just to breathe. Markets took notice with a vengeance. Bond yields surged above 30%, locking the government out of international credit markets. Investors, once eager, began to dump Ghanaian bonds, treating them as toxic. The cedi, fragile even in good years, entered free fall, losing nearly 20% of its value against the dollar in just months. For a nation dependent on imported fuel, food, and industrial goods, this was economic suffocation. Everyday life turned into a battle of survival. Transport costs skyrocketed, electricity tariffs rose, families saw the price of rice, oil, and bread double in front of their eyes. The bustling markets of Accra and Kumasi, once noisy with trade, grew quieter as household savings evaporated. For many citizens, the pre-election boom now looked like a cruel trick, promises of prosperity that ended in hunger. Behind the curtain, government finances were in chaos. Billions of dollars in contracts had been rushed through ministries without oversight. Some contractors were paid upfront, delivering half-finished projects or nothing at all. Others were left stranded with unpaid invoices, their businesses pushed toward bankruptcy. Hospitals delayed critical supply purchases, schools postponed repairs, even state-owned enterprises were gasping for liquidity. The backlog of arrears became a noose, tightening around the economy's neck. International reserves fell to a perilous level, barely enough to cover 6 weeks of imports. The very foundation of Ghana's external trade was cracking. Without dollars to buy fuel or medicine, whispers of collapse spread fast. Confidence, that most fragile currency in global finance, had evaporated. Credit rating agencies slashed Ghana's outlook. Banks tightened lending. Foreign investors fled. And all of this unfolded under the shadow of the IMF's $3 billion extended credit facility, a 36-month program that was supposed to stabilize the country. The irony was stark. Even under IMF supervision, Ghana's leaders had gambled recklessly, choosing political expedience over economic prudence. By the program's fourth review, the entire agreement teetered on the edge of collapse. Without approval, nearly $600 million in pending disbursements risked being frozen. That single freeze could have triggered the worst shock in Ghana's modern history. In those tense weeks, fear gripped every sector. Businesses braced for mass layoffs. Banks prepared for liquidity shortages. Ordinary Ghanaians queued for essentials, wondering if shelves would be empty tomorrow. The sense of sovereignty itself, the belief that Ghana controlled its own destiny, felt fragile, almost illusory. And then the unexpected pivot. Ghana's new leadership did something rare. It admitted mistakes. Reckless election spending was not defended, but condemned. In its place came a bold pledge to deliver a primary budget surplus of 1.5% of GDP not years from now, but immediately. A new fiscal rule was introduced. Spending could no longer exceed real revenue. The old habit of borrowing first and worrying later was declared dead. The IMF, once preparing to shut the door, suddenly reopened it. Instead of halting support, it approved an immediate $367 million disbursement. The decision was more than a transfer of money. It was a political statement. Ghana's reforms were credible enough to deserve a second chance. Markets breathed a little easier. Bond yields, which had soared beyond 30%, fell back to the mid-20s. The cedi found a fragile moment of stability. Banks began loosening credit just enough for businesses to stay afloat. For the first time in months, there was a flicker of hope that the free fall could be slowed. But beneath this cautious optimism lay the deeper story: a nation forced to trade short-term rescue for long-term discipline, its sovereignty tested by the invisible hand of global finance. Every bailout carries a price. For Ghana, the IMF's $367 million lifeline was wrapped in strings that cut deep. Almost overnight, the new government was forced to swallow bitter medicine, raise taxes, curb spending, and conduct a sweeping audit of the billions wasted during the pre-election frenzy of 2024. Ministries that once spent freely now faced ceilings tighter than ever before. Projects already half-built were frozen mid-construction. Civil servants accustomed to their monthly salaries suddenly waited weeks for paychecks that came late or not at all. Contractors, many of them small and mid-sized businesses who had borrowed heavily to finance government projects, were left stranded, unpaid, staring down bankruptcy. Hospitals warned of shortages. Teachers complained of arrears. Austerity was no longer a line in an IMF document, it was life on the ground. The streets of Accra, Kumasi, and Takoradi began to reveal the real cost. Fuel and transport prices crept higher. Markets passed on the burden to families already struggling. A basket of goods that once fed a family for a week now fed them for days. Small protests erupted, first in university campuses, then in market squares. They weren't massive uprisings, but they carried a sharper-edged slogans accusing the government of bowing to foreign masters, placards warning that sovereignty had been sold for survival. Yet, even amid anger, there were those who defended the reforms. Economists called it a necessary pain, the only path to restore credibility after years of reckless politics. Better bitter medicine than no medicine at all, some analysts said. On radio shows, callers debated fiercely. Was austerity the path to long-term stability, or simply another chapter of Africa's oldest dilemma, trading sovereignty for survival? The IMF itself issued a stern warning, almost like a teacher scolding a wayward student. Never again allow pre-election spending to jeopardize an entire economy. For critics, this was proof of external control, outsiders lecturing a sovereign nation. For supporters, it was a sign that Ghana had learned its lesson and could no longer hide behind political excuses. This moment was the climax of the crisis, a government caught between two fires: the demands of international creditors and the frustrations of its own people. On one side, the IMF and global markets rewarded Ghana's reforms with renewed trust, lower borrowing costs, and a fragile return of investor confidence. On the other, ordinary Ghanaians bore the weight of higher taxes, delayed pay, and rising costs. The political opposition seized the opportunity with sharp rhetoric. Leaders accused the administration of betraying the nation, of handing Ghana's economic steering wheel to Washington and Brussels. Social media hashtags exploded, some mocking the government for celebrating IMF mercy as though it were victory, others warning that Africa's independence remained an illusion as long as such institutions held the keys to survival. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from ordinary citizens. Market vendors, teachers, taxi drivers, their voices carried both pride and pain. Some admired the government's rare honesty in admitting mistakes. Others felt humiliated that their livelihoods were being dictated by conditions signed far away in boardrooms they would never see. A mother in Kumasi summed it up in a viral interview. They say this is discipline. But why must my children be the ones to eat less so politicians can pretend they have reformed? This tension captured the paradox of Ghana's moment. Reforms brought hope on paper, but hardship on the streets. The IMF's decision not to punish, but to support was unusual, even praised internationally. Yet domestically, the perception was very different. People wondered, could a nation truly rebuild when its rules were written by outsiders? At its core, the climax was not just about numbers, it was about dignity. Was Ghana charting a new path of responsibility? Or was it shackling itself once again to a cycle of control? The answer in that moment depended on where you stood inside the quiet halls of financial institutions or out in the crowded markets where survival was measured in meals, not macroeconomic surpluses. When the ink dried on the IMF agreement, the ripple effects reached far beyond parliament or financial markets. They landed squarely in the kitchens, classrooms, and paychecks of ordinary Ghanaians. The first shock came at the dinner table. Rising transport costs and new taxes pushed food prices higher. A bag of rice or maize that once stretched across a week now vanished in days. Cooking oil doubled in price in some regions. Parents were forced to make difficult choices, cutting portions, skipping meals, or pulling children out of private schools they could no longer afford. The austerity designed to restore fiscal balance quickly translated into thinner wallets and emptier plates. Civil servants who had long relied on government salaries as stable income found themselves waiting. Paychecks arrived weeks late, sometimes not at all. Teachers reported borrowing from relatives just to buy chalk and books. Nurses complained of shortages in hospitals where wards overflowed but supplies dwindled. The very workers expected to hold society together were themselves being tested by financial strain. For small businesses, the pain was sharper. Contractors who had advanced funds for government projects were left unpaid, pushing many toward bankruptcy. Local banks, already stressed from absorbing government debt, tightened lending standards, leaving entrepreneurs without access to credit. Manufacturing slowed. Construction sites stood abandoned. Young people entering the workforce faced a barren job market where opportunities seemed to vanish before it could take root. This economic stress began to reshape Ghana's political landscape. Opposition parties seized the moment, accusing the administration of selling out the country's sovereignty. In fiery speeches, they painted the government as a puppet of Washington and Brussels, beholden to foreign creditors, while ignoring the cries of its own people. Hashtags demanding economic freedom trended across social media, amplifying anger and fueling distrust. But even within the ruling coalition, unease spread. Some ministers balked at the tight spending caps imposed by the IMF. Programs once touted as achievements, new roads, subsidies, social grants were now shelved. Political allies who had promised development to their constituencies were forced to explain why projects had frozen halfway. The credibility of the government hung not only on managing numbers, but on managing disappointment. On the streets, frustration simmered. Demonstrations, though not yet massive, grew louder and more coordinated. University students staged sit-ins demanding relief from higher fees and transport costs. Traders marched through Accra's markets holding placards that read, "We did not vote for hunger." These were not isolated grievances. They were symptoms of a deeper crisis, the clash between economic discipline and social patience. The human toll was undeniable. Families slipped back into poverty just as they thought they had escaped it. Savings accounts were drained. Inflation ate through pensions, leaving the elderly vulnerable. The sense of progress that Ghana had cultivated over the last decade seemed to evaporate, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. Would all this sacrifice lead to stability, or was it suffering without end? Yet amid the despair, some voices spoke of opportunity. Civil society groups urged citizens to see austerity as a painful but necessary reset. Economists praised the government's rare honesty in admitting past mistakes, but even they acknowledged the risk reforms, no matter how well designed, cannot succeed if the people lose faith. This was the paradox of Ghana's civil and political fallout. On one side, there was discipline, the promise of restoring credibility in the eyes of markets. On the other, there was disillusion, the risk of eroding credibility at home among citizens. The government now faced its greatest test, balancing the cold arithmetic of economics with the warm, unpredictable pulse of democracy. From Washington to London, the approval of Ghana's $367 million disbursement was read as a success story. Western financial media praised the IMF for showing flexibility, rewarding Ghana's swift pivot from reckless spending to fiscal responsibility. For policymakers in the United States, it became proof that conditional discipline could still work in Africa, that when leaders acknowledged mistakes and embraced austerity, global markets would respond with trust. But the view from the ground and across much of Africa was far more complicated. Critics argued that Washington's praise revealed the deeper truth: the IMF functions less as a partner and more as an instrument of Western influence. By tying Ghana's survival to strict fiscal targets, it reaffirmed a hierarchy where African nations must continually prove their worth to institutions dominated by US and European interests. Sovereignty, in this view, was once again conditional. Elsewhere on the continent, leaders watched closely. In Kenya, Zambia, and Egypt, finance ministers studied the Ghana case as both warning and blueprint. Could open admission of failure and rapid reform unlock new streams of financing, or would it simply trap their economies in the same cycle of dependency, bailout, austerity, unrest, repeat? For nations already negotiating with the IMF, Ghana became a mirror reflecting both the potential and the peril of accepting its terms. China and Russia too paid attention. In Beijing, Ghana's crisis highlighted the vulnerability of African economies to Western-dominated finance, strengthening China's argument for alternative lending structures through its Belt and Road Initiative. In Moscow, strategists pointed to Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger countries that had rejected IMF dependency and instead sought security and economic alliances beyond the Western orbit. The Sahel, under leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, was presented as an alternative path: sovereignty first, even if it meant short-term hardship. This contrast struck a nerve with many African citizens. While Ghana turned inward under IMF supervision, Burkina Faso projected a different message, one of resistance and independence. Traoré's policies, from nationalizing gold mines to rejecting Western aid conditions, stood as a counter-narrative that Africa need not always look to Washington or Brussels for approval. For older generations across the continent, and especially for the African diaspora in the US, this raised a profound question: was Ghana's bailout survival or surrender? The American public, particularly older viewers who remember the Cold War, may recognize the pattern. Just as Washington once used financial and military aid to exert influence over smaller nations, today, institutions like the IMF extend leverage not through soldiers, but through balance sheets. For critics, Ghana's bailout was not just about economics. It was geopolitics disguised as fiscal reform. And yet there was also a lesson of responsibility. Some argued that Ghana's leaders showed rare courage in admitting mistakes, something Western governments themselves often avoid. In this sense, the IMF deal was seen by optimists as a partnership of accountability, a step toward maturity in African governance. But the larger question remains unresolved. Does this represent a new IMF, more flexible, more willing to trust African reforms, or is it still the same cycle of control packaged with gentler words? For Africa's future, the answer matters deeply, and for the United States, the way it engages with nations like Ghana will determine whether it is seen as a true ally or just another empire cloaked in financial power. Ghana's $367 million deal with the IMF did more than keep the lights on. It bought the nation precious months of stability in exchange for painful austerity and outside oversight. On paper, markets calmed, credit ratings improved, and the cedi steadied. But beneath those numbers lies the harder truth: ordinary citizens are paying the price, and the question of sovereignty lingers unanswered. This is the paradox of modern Africa. Survival today may mean sacrificing tomorrow. By accepting the IMF's terms, Ghana has momentarily escaped collapse, but at the cost of political strain, public anger, and the risk of deeper dependency. One wrong step, a dip in cocoa prices, a global interest rate shock, or another cycle of reckless election spending could send the country spiraling again. The lesson is not just about Ghana, it is about the fragility of African economies still chained to external approval. But there is another path, and it is being written in real time. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré has staked everything on the principle of sovereignty. Rather than bend to institutions like the IMF, his government has nationalized gold mines, rejected conditional loans, and pursued alliances within the Sahel and across the global south. His vision is controversial, even risky, but it speaks to a yearning across the continent, the desire for Africa to set its own terms. So here is the question I leave with you. Can we continue to trust external bailouts as the foundation of stability? Or must Africa, like Traoré insists, reclaim its destiny by charting its own economic future? For older generations in America, watching this unfold, the echoes of history are familiar. We have seen nations rise and fall not because of weapons, but because of who controls the purse strings. The same question now faces Africa. Will it remain a borrower or finally become a builder? What do you think? Has Ghana taken its first step toward lasting independence or walked straight into a subtler form of dependency? Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's model of sovereignty offers a real alternative for Africa's future? Please share this video if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines.